Why the U.S. and Iran became enemies, oil, power, and the road to war. This is not just a story about two countries. It is a story about a broken alliance, a revolution, a hostage crisis, a nuclear standoff, and an oil route so important that even a threat to it can shake the entire global economy. Today, the United States and Iran stand as bitter rivals. But that was not always true. There was a time when Washington saw Iran as one of its most important partners in the Middle East. And to understand how allies became enemies, you have to go back to the moment when oil, power, and foreign intervention first collided inside Iran. In the early Cold War years, Iran mattered for two reasons: geography and oil. It sat in a strategic position near the Soviet Union, and it held enormous energy resources. Then, in 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry, taking control away from foreign interests. 2 years later, in 1953, he was overthrown in a coup whose U.S. role is documented in the State Department's historical record. For many Iranians, that moment became proof that Washington would intervene when its interests were threatened. For Washington, backing the Shah seemed like stability. For many in Iran, it looked like control from abroad. That memory never disappeared. Then came 1979. The year everything changed. Iran's Islamic Revolution swept away the Shah and replaced him with a new anti-American Islamic Republic. Soon after, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took American diplomats hostage for 444 days. From that point on, mistrust became the foundation of everything. The United States no longer saw Iran as an ally. Iran no longer saw the United States as a partner. Both began to see the other as a threat. And over time, that hostility became bigger than diplomacy. For the United States, the main goals became clear: stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, limit its ballistic missiles, contain the armed groups it supports across the region, protect shipping lanes, and defend allies such as Israel and U.S. partners in the Gulf. Reuters reported that Washington wanted talks to cover Iran's nuclear program, missiles, support for armed groups, and other security concerns. Iran's goals are different. Tehran wants regime survival, sanctions relief, recognition of its sovereignty, and recognition of what it calls its right to peaceful uranium enrichment. Reuters also reported that Iran has insisted on sanctions relief and recognition of its enrichment rights, while refusing to give up enrichment completely or include its missile program in the talks. So the deadlock is simple but dangerous. Washington wants Iran more constrained. Tehran wants Washington to stop trying to box it in. That is why the nuclear issue became the heart of the conflict. In 2015, Iran and major world powers signed the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. The idea was simple. Iran would limit its nuclear program and accept strict monitoring, and in return, it would get sanctions relief. But in 2018, the United States withdrew from that agreement. After that, the deal began to unravel, and Iran's enrichment rose far beyond the original limits. Reuters and the IAEA have reported that Iran later accumulated uranium enriched to 60%, a level the IAEA described as a serious concern because it is close to weapons grade compared with the roughly 90% associated with a bomb. That is why every new round of talks feels urgent, and every failed round feels dangerous. But this rivalry is not just Washington versus Tehran. It pulls in an entire region. On the U.S. side, Israel is the clearest and hardest-line partner against Iran, and the American military presence stretches across the region through bases and partnerships in places Reuters identified as Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, and Turkey. At the same time, many Gulf states are deeply uncomfortable with a full-scale war because they could become targets if conflict expands. Reuters reported that Iran explicitly warned Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, and Bahrain against supporting a strike or allowing their territory or airspace to be used against it. So even countries close to Washington often try to balance security ties with fear of being dragged into the fire. Iran also has its own network. For years, Tehran built what Reuters described as an axis of resistance, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shiite armed groups in Iraq and Syria. That network gave Iran reach beyond its borders and allowed it to pressure enemies indirectly. But Iran also has relationships with larger powers. Russia and China have often given Tehran diplomatic support against Western pressure, especially in forums like the UN, although Reuters has also reported that both have limits and are not guaranteed military rescuers in a direct war. So when people ask which countries support Iran, the real answer is this: Iran has proxy partners that can fight, and major powers that may back it politically, but not necessarily unconditionally. And then there is oil, the part of this story that affects almost every country on Earth. Iran sits beside the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important energy choke points in the world. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says that in 2024, oil flows through Hormuz averaged about 20 million barrels per day, roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. It is not just Iranian oil that passes there. Exports from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar depend heavily on that route too. The EIA also says about 20% of global LNG trade moved through Hormuz in 2024, mainly from Qatar. So if Hormuz is threatened, the issue is no longer just U.S. versus Iran. It becomes a global energy emergency. That is exactly why oil prices react so fast to rising tensions. Even before a war begins, markets start pricing in fear. Reuters reported that when security risks rose in the region and the U.S. prepared a partial evacuation of its embassy in Iraq, oil prices jumped more than 4%. The EIA has also warned that an extended disruption in Hormuz is the main upside risk for higher oil prices. And once tankers, insurers, and traders start worrying about attacks, the world pays more, not just at oil terminals, but at fuel pumps, shipping companies, airlines, and factories. That is why a confrontation between Washington and Tehran can hit inflation, trade, and growth far beyond the Middle East. So why are the United States and Iran still enemies? Because this conflict is built on layers that were never truly resolved. The 1953 coup, the 1979 revolution, the hostage crisis, sanctions, the nuclear dispute, regional militias, and the constant fear that one wrong move in the Gulf could trigger a war with global consequences. This is why every new escalation feels bigger than a normal rivalry. Because it is not just about history, it is about who controls power in the Middle East, who controls the flow of energy, and whether either side is willing to step back before the cost becomes global.